A cold autumn wind blew fallen leaves across the Manhattan sidewalk. William Anderson left the building of his company, Anderson Tech Solutions, late at night as usual. His black Mercedes was waiting at the entrance, but today he decided to walk. Insomnia had been plaguing him more and more lately, and fresh air might help calm his thoughts. "Mr. Anderson, do you want me to call the driver?" the guard asked, looking up at the dark sky with concern. "No, thank you, Peter. I'm going for a walk tonight," William replied, wrapping himself in a warm coat. His footsteps echoed in the empty street. At 35 years old, he had achieved everything he could have dreamed of. His own tech company, a fortune of several $100 million, a penthouse overlooking Central Park. But every night, when he was alone, he felt the same emptiness that had haunted him since childhood. On the corner of Fifth Avenue, a young woman sitting on the sidewalk, leaning against the wall of a building, caught his attention. Her thin cloak obviously did not protect her from the cold, but she did not shiver. She did not even seem to notice the chill. William had always passed by such people, but something in her posture made him stop. "Miss, are you okay?" he asked, coming closer. The girl looked up and William froze. Her face was tired, but it retained a certain special nobility. Her large brown eyes looked with challenge and dignity. "Everything is fine," she answered firmly. "I'm just resting." "At 1 in the morning? On a cold sidewalk?" William raised an eyebrow. "Do you often interrogate strangers on the street?" she retorted. William smiled involuntarily. Even in such a situation, the girl maintained her sense of dignity. "I'm William Anderson," he introduced himself. "Now we're not complete strangers anymore." She hesitated, then answered, Catherine Wilson." At that moment, the moonlight fell on her neck and something glittered. William looked closely and saw an ancient crescent-shaped pendant hanging from a thin chain. His heart skipped a beat. His younger sister had been wearing the same one the day of the accident. "It's a nice pendant," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "A family heirloom." Catherine instinctively grabbed the jewelry. "The only thing left of my parents. Listen." William paused, searching for words. "I realize you don't know me, but it's cold outside, and there's a nice all-day cafe a block away. Perhaps you would agree to have coffee with me." She sounded bitter, expecting something in return. "Thank you, but no. No strings attached," William said firmly. "Just coffee and conversation. If you want, you can tell me why you're sitting here alone in the middle of the night." Catherine stared at his face for a long time, as if trying to read his ulterior motives. Finally, she slowly stood up. "Okay, but only coffee." They walked in silence. William watched his companion out of the corner of his eye. Her confident gait and straight back betrayed a good upbringing, which contrasted strangely with her shabby clothes. The cafe was almost empty. They sat down at a table by the window, and a tired waitress took their order. "So, what brings a successful businessman out for a night out?" asked Catherine, warming her hands on her coffee cup. "How do you know I'm successful?" William was surprised. "The Burberry coat, the Patek Philippe watch," she smiled weakly. "I worked in a fashion boutique until—" She suddenly fell silent. "Until what?" "Until the owner decided that the young saleswoman should be more accommodating." Her face tensed. "I refused, and he found a reason to fire me. Without references, it's hard to find a new job, and he only had enough savings for 2 months of rent." William felt a wave of anger rise inside him. "Did you file a complaint against him?" "With my word against his." Catherine laughed bitterly. "I don't even have money for a lawyer." She ran her finger along the edge of the cup. "You know, the worst thing is not poverty. The worst thing is the feeling that you are completely alone, that no one cares whether you survive or not." Her words touched something deep in William's soul. He knew this feeling too. After the death of his parents and the disappearance of his sister, he had lived with this burden of loneliness for a long time. And your family? He asked cautiously. Friends? I grew up in an orphanage, she answered simply. This pendant is the only memory of my real family. I was told it was found on me when I was brought there as a baby. William felt his heart start to beat faster. He remembered the exact same pendant around his 3-year-old sister's neck on the day of the accident. But it couldn't be a coincidence, could it? Listen, Catherine, he began slowly. I want to help you. Not out of pity, but because I know how hard it is to start over on your own. I don't accept charity, she replied sharply. This is not charity. This is an investment. He took out his business card. My company has just opened a vacancy for a sales assistant. If you have experience working in a boutique, you already know the basics of working with clients. Catherine took the card incredulously. Why are you doing this? William looked her straight in the eye. Let's just say I believe in karma, and that sometimes you have to trust your intuition. When they said goodbye outside the cafe, he insisted on paying for her to stay in a hotel nearby, at least for a few days until she got back on her feet. On his way home, William couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting was no accident. He took out his phone and dialed the number. Mike, it's Bill. Sorry to call you so late. I need your help with something. Yes, it's a private investigation. I need to check out a person, Catherine Wilson. The next morning, Catherine stood in front of the mirror in her hotel room for a long time, looking at her reflection. The new day brought with it doubts. Was she right to accept help from a stranger? Her experience told her that free cheese only comes in a mousetrap. The phone on her bedside table vibrated. A message from William Anderson. Good morning. I'm waiting for you at the office at 10 o'clock. The address is on the business card. Security has been alerted. Catherine took a deep breath. At least it was worth a try. At 10 o'clock, she was standing in front of the huge glass building of Anderson Tech Solutions. Her shabby clothes stood in stark contrast to the business suits of the people rushing to work. Miss Wilson? The security guard smiled kindly. Mr. Anderson is waiting for you. 32nd floor. An elegant middle-aged woman met her in the office. I'm Margaret Turner, HR Director. Mr. Anderson told me about you. Her gaze took in Catherine's appearance with a professional appraisal. Before we discuss the details of the job, I think we should take care of the appropriate dress code. Catherine began, but Margaret interrupted her. Mr. Anderson has ordered that you be issued a company card for any necessary purchases. It's standard practice for new employees. Standard practice? Catherine thought. Hardly. 2 hours later, she was sitting in William's office, dressed in a new business suit. You look very nice, he said, looking up from his papers. Mr. Anderson, William, please. William, Catherine tried to sound firm. I appreciate everything, but I don't understand why you're doing this. No one gives a stranger a job and spends thousands of dollars on it for nothing. He leaned back in his chair. You know, when I was 7 years old, I lost my entire family in a car accident. My parents died instantly. My little sister. He paused. Her body was never found. I was raised by relatives, but I always felt alone. Catherine listened in silence. William continued. When I saw you yesterday, this may sound strange, but I saw in you the same loneliness I felt. And if I can help someone get out of this hole, why not? But you don't know anything about me, Catherine objected. I could be a con artist. William smiled. A con artist would not doubt my motives. And I know something about you. He pulled out a file. I'm sorry, but I had to check your history. Here are your papers from St. Mary's Orphanage, records of your work at the elite fashion boutique. A certificate of dismissal, by the way, absolutely illegal. My lawyers are already working on this issue. Catherine felt herself blushing. You hired a private investigator. It's a standard procedure for all high-level employees. High-level? She repeated. I thought I was just going to be a sales assistant. No. William shook his head. "I want to offer you the position of my personal assistant. The salary is twice as high, but the responsibility is more serious." Catherine felt dizzy. "Why me? You must have experienced candidates." "Because I trust my intuition," he answered simply. "And one more thing." He opened his desk drawer and took out an old photo. "This is my sister on the day of the accident. Pay attention to her neck." Catherine looked closely and felt her heart sink. The photo had the exact same pendant as hers. This could be a coincidence," she whispered. "It could be," William agreed. "But I'd like to know the truth. If you agree to work with me, of course." Catherine touched her pendant. All her life she had dreamed of finding out the truth about her past, about her family. And now, "I agree," she finally said. "But with one condition." "What was it?" "No more gifts or charity, only honest work and professional relationships." William smiled and held out his hand. "It's a deal. Welcome to the team, Miss Wilson." That evening, sitting in her new office, Catherine tried to process everything that had happened over the past 24 hours. Yesterday, she was sitting on a cold sidewalk, not knowing where she would spend the night. Today, she was a millionaire's personal assistant and possibly on the verge of uncovering the secret of her origins. Her eyes fell on the photo William had given her, a little girl with a crescent moon pendant smiling at the camera. Was it really possible? After all these years of loneliness, had she finally found her family? The phone vibrated. A message from William. "There is an important meeting tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Your presence is required. Also, happy housewarming." The message had an address attached, an apartment in a good neighborhood. Just a professional relationship? Catherine thought ironically. It seems that William Anderson was not used to backing down from his plans. The office of Michael Donovan, a private detective, resembled an archive. All the walls were lined with files and documents. William sat in a worn leather chair, tapping his fingers impatiently on the armrest. "So, what did you find?" he asked when Mike closed the door. "It's a strange story, Bill." The detective pulled out a thick folder. "Very strange. I checked all the documents from St. Mary's Orphanage. Catherine did come there as an infant, it's confirmed, but there are nuances." He spread some yellowed papers on the table. "Look, the date of her arrival is September 15th, 1995, 3 days after the accident that killed your parents." William felt his heart start to beat faster. "It could be a coincidence." "Maybe," Mike agreed. "But there's something else. I found the police report on the accident. Your sister wasn't the only child to go missing that day. The report mentions the abduction of several children from different crash sites." "What?" William sat up straight. "Why have I never heard of this?" "Because the case was classified. It seems to have been an organized crime group that used car accidents as a cover to kidnap children. They would set up accidents and then take advantage of the chaos to take the children." William felt sick to his stomach. "And what happened to these children?" "Most ended up in various orphanages across the country. Some were returned to their families, but many were never found." Mike pulled out another document. "This is the report of the social worker who brought Catherine to the orphanage. She notes that the girl was found near the highway, not far from the site of one of the accidents. She was wearing only pajamas and a silver pendant. William remembered a picture of his sister. She had been wearing pajamas with teddy bears that morning. Did you check the other accidents that day?" Mike nodded. "There were 5 of them. Your parents died in the 3rd one, and it was after that that your sister disappeared." William stood up and went to the window. Thoughts were swarming in his head. Who was behind all this? Most of the gang members are dead or in prison, but there's one person who might know more. Mike handed him a photo of an elderly woman. "Martha Reynolds. She worked in that orphanage as a nurse, and she was there when Catherine was brought in. Is she still alive?" Yes, she lives in a nursing home in New Jersey. I've already arranged to meet her. William returned to the table. Is there anything else about Catherine? Yes. Mike opened his laptop. I checked her last place of employment. You were right about the wrongful termination. The boutique owner, Robert Pierce, has a long history of harassing female employees. Most keep quiet for fear of losing their jobs. Send all the materials to my lawyers. William clenched his fists. This time, he would not pay off. On the way back to the office, William couldn't stop thinking about what he had learned. If Catherine really was his sister, but how to tell her? And is she ready for this truth? Catherine herself met him in the reception area. You have a meeting in 20 minutes with the board of directors, and they called from Tokyo. William looked at her and saw something he hadn't noticed before. The same brown eyes as his mother's, the same gesture when she tucked her hair behind her ear. William? Are you okay? Her voice brought him out of his reverie. Yeah, I'm just tired. Listen, would you like to come with me to New Jersey tomorrow? I have an important meeting. Sure. She was already opening the calendar on her tablet. What time do we leave? 9 o'clock. And, Catherine, he hesitated. Take your pendant with you. She looked at him in surprise, but said nothing. That evening, William sat in his study for a long time, looking at old family photos. Here he was with his sister on the beach. Here she is blowing out the candles on her 3rd birthday cake, and everywhere the same crescent moon pendant. His phone vibrated. A message from Mike. Found something else. Catherine's medical records from the orphanage. She has the same rare blood type as your sister. Also, there is a small burn scar on her left leg. It's exactly the same as the one your sister had after the hot tea incident. William felt his hands shaking. Too many coincidences. Too many for it to be a coincidence. He went to the window and looked out at Manhattan at night. Somewhere out there in the small apartment he'd rented for her, Catherine might be awake too, thinking about tomorrow's trip. Does she have a clue? Is she ready for the truth? Suddenly, his eyes fell on an old photo on the table. He and his parents and sister all smiling, happy. The last photo before the accident. I will find the truth, he whispered. I promise. The drive to New Jersey took longer than planned, with traffic jams on the way out of Manhattan leaving them stranded for almost an hour. Catherine tried several times to ask William about the purpose of the trip, but he answered evasively, staring at the road. The Tihaya Gavan nursing home turned out to be an ordinary 3-story red brick building. The small garden in front of the entrance was neatly maintained, but it felt like an autumnal abandonment. Fallen leaves covered the paths, and the flower beds were already empty. We've come to talk to a former employee of your orphanage, William finally explained as he parked the car. Her name is Martha Reynolds. She worked there as a nurse in the 90s. Catherine tensed. Why didn't you tell me this before? I hired a private investigator, William admitted. After our first meeting, something was bothering me. A young nurse met them at the reception desk. Mrs. Reynolds is in her room. She is not feeling well today, so please do not stay long. Martha's room was small but cozy. The elderly woman was sitting in a chair by the window wrapped in a blanket. A glass of water and several boxes of medicine were on the table next to her. Mrs. Reynolds? William spoke softly. I'm William Anderson. We had an appointment. Martha turned her head slowly. Her eyes were tired but aware. Yes, Detective Donovan warned me. Her gaze moved to Catherine and she suddenly froze. Oh my God, what is it? Catherine tensed. Those eyes, Martha whispered. I remember them. You look so much like your mother. Catherine took a step back. No, Martha shook her head. But I saw the photos in your file when you were brought to us. There was a family photo. She suddenly coughed, and William quickly poured her some water. Tell me everything you remember about that day, he asked, when Martha regained her breath. It was September 15th, 95, she began slowly. I remember because it was my first day back from vacation. You were brought in early in the morning. You were so small, scared. You were wearing teddy bear pajamas and this pendant. Catherine involuntarily touched the jewelry around her neck. The social worker said you were found near the highway, Marta continued. But something was wrong with that story. The documents were drawn up retroactively. I know this for sure, because I was the one who kept the medical records. What do you mean? William tensed up. Usually, when a child was brought to us, there was a lot of paperwork, police reports, medical certificates, acts of social services, and here there was almost nothing, only basic documents, and they came a few days later. Marta coughed again, this time harder. When the attack passed, she looked even more tired. I had been working in the orphanage for 15 years and I knew something was wrong, especially after that incident with the detective. What detective? William asked quickly. A private detective. He came a week after Catherine was brought in. He asked about her, showed me some photos, and the next day he was found dead in his car. Officially, a heart attack, but she fell silent, catching her breath. Catherine sat motionless, clutching the armrests of her chair. I still have copies of some documents, Marta finally said. I didn't trust the whole story at the time, so I made copies of everything that seemed important. She pointed to the chest of drawers. In the bottom drawer, in a blue folder. William took out the folder. Inside were old, yellowed papers, copies of Catherine's admission papers to the orphanage, a medical record, a few photographs. This is all I could save, Marta said quietly. I wanted to go to the police, but she shook her head. After that detective died, I was scared. I had a family, children. William flipped through the documents, his hands shaking more and more. The date of birth, blood type, special features, everything matched his sister's. There's something else here. Martha pulled an envelope out from under the blanket. The photo that the detective brought. I hid it back then. Maybe it will clarify something. The photo showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. William recognized them immediately. It was the last photo of their family taken a week before the accident. Catherine came over and looked over his shoulder, her face pale. That pendant, on the girl, it's exactly like mine. This is my family, William said quietly. My sister disappeared the day of the accident, and she was never found. The room fell silent, broken only by the noise of the fan and distant voices from the corridor. I need some air, Catherine suddenly said, and quickly left the room. Martha looked after her. Give her time. It's not easy to know that your whole life could have been different. William nodded as he gathered his papers. Thank you. For everything. Be careful, Martha warned. If my suspicion is correct, and there was an organized group behind this, they could still be dangerous. By the time they returned to New York, the sun was setting. Catherine stared silently out the window, touching her pendant from time to time. What's next? She finally asked. There is only one way to find out the truth for sure, William answered. A DNA test. Catherine turned to him. And if the result is negative? Then at least we'll know, he replied simply. But something tells me that's not the case. She fell silent again, looking out at the lights of the approaching city. Her life could change forever, and it was frightening and exciting at the same time. A week passed after the trip to New Jersey. Catherine threw herself into her work, trying not to think about everything she had learned. But every time she saw William, the questions came up again and again. This morning she came to the office earlier than usual. She needed to prepare documents for an important meeting, but her thoughts kept returning to that old photo from Martha's envelope. You're here already? William's voice made her jump. He was standing in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. Yes, I wanted to finish the paperwork for the meeting with the investors, she replied, taking the coffee. William sat down in the chair across from her. "I wanted to talk to you. Not like a boss with an assistant, but—" He trailed off, searching for words. "As a possible brother with a possible sister." Catherine tried to smile, but it came out strained. "Yeah," he sighed. "I know it all sounds incredible, but the more I learn, the more I'm convinced. What exactly do you want to know?" Catherine interrupted him. "Everything," he answered simply. "Tell me about your childhood, about what you remember." Catherine put down her coffee and went to the window. Behind the glass, New York City was waking up, the streets filled with people rushing to work. "I don't remember much about my early years," she began slowly. "My first clear memory is of the orphanage. A large room with 6 beds, gray walls. I always slept by the window and looked at the stars before going to bed." She turned to William. "You know what's strange? I have this memory. Maybe it's just a dream, but it seems so real. I'm sitting in the kitchen, a cup of hot cocoa in front of me. There is a boy next to me. He is telling me something and laughing, and then I knock the cup over and burn my leg." William straightened up sharply. "It was in the summer. You were 3 years old. I was telling you about the dinosaurs I saw in the museum." "Where did you—" Catherine stumbled. "Did it really happen?" "Yes. Your mom was scared to death and took you to the hospital, and I was crying because I thought it was my fault. I made you laugh too much with my stories." Catherine slowly sank into the chair. "I have this scar. It's on my left leg. The doctors at the orphanage said it was an old burn." She suddenly remembered something else. "And this pendant. I always knew it was special. When other children asked me why I never took it off, I told them it was a gift from my mother, even though I didn't even remember her face." William took an old photo out of his briefcase. "This is our mom, Sarah Anderson. She taught literature at the college." Catherine took the photo with trembling hands. A beautiful woman with kind eyes was looking at her from the black and white picture. "You have her eyes," William said quietly, "and the same habit of biting your lip when you're nervous." Catherine touched her lips without realizing she was doing it. "And your father?" she asked. "Tom Anderson. He was an architect. He designed buildings all along the East Coast. Remember that big library in the park? That's his work." "I used to go there a lot in high school," Catherine whispered. "I used to sit by the big window and read." "Just like your mom," William smiled. "She always looked for a place by the window, too." Suddenly, Catherine remembered something else. "I had nightmares for years. I would see darkness, hear metal scraping and screaming, and then someone would carry me out, and it was very cold." William tensed. The accident happened at night. It was raining. The truck drove into the oncoming lane. He fell silent, clutching the armrests. "I was in the other car with my uncle. We were following. When it all happened, I just remember screaming and the headlights." Catherine felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "Why? Why did someone take me away? Why?" "I don't know," William answered honestly. "But I will find the answers. I promise." He went to his desk and took out an envelope. "I've arranged for a DNA test at a private clinic, the best in town. I'll have the results in a week. I paid for the urgency." He handed her the envelope. "But the decision is yours. If you're not ready—" Catherine took the envelope. "I want to know the truth, whatever it is." At that moment, the phone rang, a reminder of the meeting with the investors. "I have to go." Catherine quickly wiped away her tears. "The documents are ready. I'll send them to you by mail." "Catherine," William stopped her. "Thank you for trusting me." She smiled weakly. What else can a possible sister do? That evening, sitting in her apartment, Catherine pulled out an old box she always carried with her. It contained all of her childhood treasures: a few photos from the orphanage, her first dollar bill, a dried flower. At the very bottom was a yellowed piece of paper, her childhood drawing. She never showed it to anyone because she did not understand what it meant. The drawing showed a family: mom, dad, a boy, and a little girl. And the girl had a crescent moon pendant around her neck. Catherine looked at the picture for a long time. Perhaps somewhere deep in her subconscious she had always known the truth. Perhaps that was why she never took the pendant off. It was her only connection to the past, which was now slowly beginning to emerge from the darkness. The clock on St. Patrick's Tower showed 3 in the morning when William finally recognized that sleep would not come. He stood at the panoramic window of his Fifth Avenue penthouse clutching a glass of half-drunk whiskey. Manhattan at night stretched out before him like an ocean of lights, but his gaze was directed to the past. It was also raining that night. They were returning from their cousin Michael's birthday party. Uncle Robert was driving and 7-year-old William was dozing in the back seat. His parents' car was ahead. He remembered the parking lights flashing in the dark. Kate, his 3-year-old sister, was sleeping in the back seat, wrapped in her favorite princess blanket. And then, the blinding light of the headlights of a truck that drove into the oncoming lane, the scraping of metal, screams, and darkness. William shuddered and took a sip of whiskey. 28 years had passed, and the memories were still as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. He walked over to the massive safe built into the wall of the office and dialed the code: Kate's date of birth. Inside was an old cardboard box, his personal archive of pain. He took it out and began to go through the contents. Here were newspaper clippings, yellowed by time. Under the newspaper clippings was his old diary with a worn leather cover. He started keeping it at 14, when a school psychologist advised him to get his emotions out on paper. William opened it to a random page. September 12, 2002. Today there was a parent-teacher conference at school. Everyone came with their moms and dads. Aunt Ellen tried to be caring, but it's not the same. It will never be the same. After school, I went to the cemetery. I brought my mom her favorite white roses. I brought my dad a new issue of an architectural magazine. I told them about my grades, that I wanted to go to MIT. And then I sat by Kate's empty grave for a long time. I know she's not there. I know it's just a symbolic place. But sometimes it seems that only here I can talk to her. William turned a few pages forward. March 3rd, 2003. The same dream again. Kate is calling me, holding out her hands. She's wearing the same teddy bear pajamas as the day of the accident, and a crescent moon pendant around her neck. I run to her, but I can't reach her, and then it disappears in the dark, and I wake up in a cold sweat. My uncle says I need to see a psychotherapist. Maybe he's right. But how can I let go and move on when I don't even know what happened to my little sister? His phone vibrated, pulling him out of his memories. A message from Catherine. Can't sleep either? His fingers hovered over the screen. How could he explain to a stranger that her every feature, every gesture, reminded him of his lost sister? Too many memories, he finally answered. Tell me about her, about little Kate. William took a deep breath and began to type. She was a sunny child. Always smiling, always on the move. My mom said she had a little bell in her. She didn't walk, she danced. She loved it when I read her fairy tales before bedtime, especially about princesses. She had a favorite cup with a painted unicorn on it. He stopped, feeling something tighten in his chest. Then he continued. Every morning she would wait for me to wake up, sitting outside my door with her favorite book. We had a special ritual. I would draw a smiling face with maple syrup on her pancakes. She believed that it made them magical. In the orphanage, I also always asked to draw smiling faces on the food. The teachers were surprised by this habit, Catherine replied. William felt his hands tremble. He walked over to the safe and took out another box, a smaller one, but priceless. It contained his parents' personal belongings, salvaged from the wrecked car, his mother's diary with a velvet cover, Dad's watch, which miraculously did not break on impact, photos that he knew by heart, and a small silver chain with a crescent moon pendant, an exact copy of the one worn by Catherine, a family heirloom. Mom bought two identical sets when Kate was born, so that you would always be together, she said at the time. The moon guides us home even on the darkest night. William picked up his phone and started scrolling through photos, scanned images from the past. Here he and Kate are on the beach. He's building a sandcastle. She's carefully decorating it with seashells. Here is Christmas morning. Kate in her reindeer pajamas is unwrapping presents, her eyes shining with delight. It's her mother's birthday. The whole family is at the festive table. Kate is sitting on his lap and trying to blow out the candles with her mother. The new day was already beginning to turn gray outside the window. In the pre-dawn silence, the city seemed particularly vulnerable, as did the memories that filled his heart. "What was your father like?" asked Catherine. William looked at the message for a long time before answering. He was an architect, a talented one, but most importantly, he was an amazing father. He took us to the park every weekend and taught us how to fly kites. When Kate had a sore throat, he would sit by her bedside all night and tell her stories about the buildings he designed, turning every skyscraper into a fairy tale castle. And Mom? She taught literature at the college. She had the most beautiful laugh in the world and the kindest heart. She always said that every person was an unread book, and you should be careful with other people's stories. William fell silent, feeling tears stinging his eyes. He hadn't cried in years, not since the day the 7-year-old realized he was alone. "Thank you for telling me," Catherine wrote. "See you in the morning, maybe brother." He looked out at the waking city. Somewhere out there, in the apartment he had rented for her, was a girl who could be his lost sister. A girl with the same pendant around her neck, with the same gestures and habits, with the same emptiness in her heart that a lost family leaves. "Good night," he replied, and for the first time in many years, he felt that perhaps the emptiness in his heart would finally begin to fill. The private clinic, Manhattan Medical, occupied the entire 5th floor of a modern building on the Upper East Side. Catherine sat in the spacious waiting room, nervously tapping her fingers on the arm of her leather chair. William was talking to the receptionist, filling out the necessary paperwork. "Why does such an expensive clinic need to know my blood type?" thought Catherine, flipping through the endless medical questionnaire. Her eyes stopped at the family diseases box. She had always skipped this question. No one in the orphanage knew her medical history. "Everything is ready," William returned with the papers. "Dr. Rachel Morgan will see us. She's the best geneticist in town." Catherine nodded, unable to say a word. Fear and hope mixed in her soul in a strange cocktail that made her dizzy. Dr. Morgan was an elegant middle-aged woman with an attentive gaze and a calm smile. "Mr. Anderson, Miss Wilson, please follow me." Her office smelled of lavender, probably to calm nervous patients, Catherine thought. "I've reviewed your situation," the doctor began, sitting down at the table. "You are looking for confirmation of a possible relationship, correct?" "Yes," William replied. "We suspect that Catherine may be my missing sister." Dr. Morgan nodded. "Genetic testing for kinship is a very accurate method. We use state-of-the-art equipment and test for 16 different genetic markers. This gives us an accuracy rate of over 99%. She pulled out 2 sterile sampling kits. "The procedure is simple, a swab on the inside of the cheek. It's completely painless." Catherine felt her hands shaking. "And how long will the test take?" "Normally, it takes 2 weeks, but Mr. Anderson paid for an emergency test. The results will be ready in a week. A week. 7 days that could change her life." After the samples were taken and packaged in special envelopes, Dr. Morgan said, "I realize this is going to be a difficult week of waiting. Try to keep your mind off it. Do your normal activities." "Do normal things?" Catherine thought. "How can you do normal things when your whole life may not be what it seemed?" The next few days were filled with anticipation. Catherine tried to immerse herself in her work, but her thoughts kept returning to the test. She would find herself spending hours looking at her reflection in the mirror, searching for similarities with the Anderson family photos. William had changed too. He became more silent and thoughtful. Sometimes she noticed him looking at her with a long, studying gaze, as if trying to recognize his little sister in her features. On the third day of waiting, Catherine could not stand it and wrote to him, "What if the result is negative?" The answer came almost instantly. "Then we'll just keep looking. But something tells me that won't happen." "Why are you so sure?" "There are too many coincidences. The pendant, the burn scar, your memories, and there's something else." "What?" "When you laugh, you wrinkle your nose just like our mom. I noticed it the first time we met." Catherine felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had never known such little things about herself. Which parent gave her the color of her eyes, whose smile she inherited, whose habits she repeated? On the fifth day of waiting, she had a dream. She is a little girl sitting in the kitchen. A boy is next to her, telling her something funny, showing her a book with dinosaurs. There is a cup of hot cocoa on the table. She laughs and accidentally pushes the cup. Catherine woke up in a cold sweat, automatically touching the scar on her leg. That same day, she went to the public library and found old newspaper clippings. She spent hours reading about the accident, about the disappearance of little Catherine Anderson, about the unsuccessful search. One of the photos was of 7-year-old William, a little boy with huge, sad eyes being hugged by his aunt. On the sixth day, William invited her to dinner. They sat in a small Italian restaurant trying to talk about anything but the test. "You know," he suddenly said, "when Kate was little, she always asked for spaghetti for dinner. But she ate it in a special way. She wrapped it around her fork and lifted it high, high, high before popping it into her mouth." Catherine froze with the spaghetti fork halfway to her mouth in that exact position. "I'm sorry," William said quickly. "I didn't mean to—" No, it's okay." She put the fork down. "It's just strange. I always eat pasta like this. I never thought about why." On the morning of the seventh day, they both came to the office earlier than usual. Catherine tried to concentrate on the documents, but the letters were blurring before her eyes. William read the same email 3 times. At 10 o'clock, the phone rang. The clinic's number. "The results are ready," Dr. Morgan said. "Can you come over?" The drive to the clinic seemed endless. They were silent. All words were unnecessary. At the reception desk, they were immediately shown to Dr. Morgan's office. She was sitting at her desk with an envelope in her hands. "Before I give you the results," she began, "I want to make sure you're both ready to hear them." Catherine gripped the armrests of her chair so hard that her knuckles turned white. William simply nodded. Dr. Morgan opened the envelope and pulled out a sheet of results. "We ran a full DNA analysis and compared 16 genetic markers." "Please," Catherine interrupted her, "just tell me." The doctor looked at them over the top of her glasses and smiled softly. "The results show a 100% match. You are brother and sister." Standing at the window of Dr. Morgan's office, Catherine felt the world around her change. Those few words, "You are brother and sister," turned her whole life upside down. Thousands of thoughts swarmed through her mind, but she could not grasp any of them. "Please, sit down," the doctor's voice came as if from far away. This news takes time to realize. William was already holding the results of the analysis in his hands, his eyes quickly running over the lines of text. "It says here that there is a complete match on the maternal and paternal lines." "What does that mean?" "It means," Dr. Morgan spoke softly but clearly, "that you share biological parents. We also compared your DNA to the samples you provided. The hair from your mother's hairbrush and the blood from your father's hospital record. It's a perfect match." Catherine finally sank into the chair. Her hand involuntarily reached for the pendant. So, it's all true. The accident, the kidnapping. Yes, William put down the papers. His hands were trembling a little. You are Catherine Anderson, my younger sister, whom I have been searching for 28 years. Suddenly, Catherine laughed, hysterically, with a hint of despair. You know what's funny? All my life I dreamed of finding my family. I imagined different scenarios. Maybe I was abandoned because of poverty. Maybe my mother was too young. But never did I think that the truth would be like this. She stood up abruptly and went to the window. Someone kidnapped me, took me away from my loving family, sent me to an orphanage, and all these years you've been looking for me, and I didn't even know I was being searched for. William walked over to her and gently touched her shoulder. Now, we know the truth, and we will find those who did this. Dr. Morgan coughed delicately. I have prepared a complete package of documents for you. It contains the results of all the tests, comparative analyses, genetic markers. All of this is legally binding and can be used in court. In court, Catherine turned around. Yes, William said firmly. We will find those responsible. Mike, my private investigator, has already gathered a lot of information. Now that we have proof of our relationship, we can officially reopen the investigation. They left the clinic on a sunny fall day. New York City was going about its normal life. People were hurrying about their business. Taxis were honking in traffic. Street musicians were playing in the park. But for Catherine, everything looked different, as if she was looking at the world through a new lens. Do you want to go home? William asked. Home where? She smiled bitterly. To my rented apartment or to my place, he said softly. There's something I want to show you. His penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the historic building, but instead of leading Catherine into the living room, William took her to his study. All these years, he began, walking over to the safe, I've kept things that reminded me of our family. I hoped that one day I could show them to you. He took out a large box and carefully placed it on the table. Here is everything I managed to save after the accident and what I have collected over the years. Catherine slowly walked over to the table. The box contained photo albums, letters, and personal items. This is Mom's diary. William took out a velvet-covered book. She kept it from the day you were born. Here, listen. He carefully opened the yellowed pages. Today Kate said her first word, book. Tom is laughing, saying she will definitely be a teacher like me. And William is so proud. He reads her stories all the time. Catherine felt tears streaming down her cheeks. I don't remember her voice. I don't remember what she looked like. She was beautiful, William said quietly, and you look a lot like her. He pulled out a photograph of a young woman holding a little girl with a warm smile. And this is our dad, he showed another photo. Tom Anderson, one of the most famous architects of his time. Do you see that tall building outside the window? That's his project. Catherine took the photo with trembling hands. The man in the picture looked kind and wise, his eyes laughing just like William's. And this? He hesitated before taking out the next item. Is the second pendant in the set. Mom bought 2 of them for you and for herself. She said the moon would always lead us home. Catherine touched her pendant, then reached out to the one William was holding. They were absolutely identical. You know, she whispered, I never took it off in the orphanage, not even at night. I felt that there was something special about it, something important. Now I realize that it was my only connection to the past. William took out another object, a worn teddy bear. This was your favorite. You carried it with you everywhere. It was found in the car after the accident. Catherine took the toy and suddenly a memory struck her like a bolt of lightning. Mr. Brown. I remember him. My mom sewed a new bow on him because the old one was lost. She clutched the teddy bear to her chest and burst into tears for the first time in this crazy day. All the emotions that had been building up for years finally came out. William hugged her, and they stood there for a long time, brother and sister reunited after 28 years of separation. "What now?" Catherine finally asked, wiping away her tears. "Now." William pulled away and looked her in the eye. "We start all over again, and we find those who destroyed our family." Outside the window, the sun was setting, painting the New York sky gold and purple. Catherine stood there, holding a photo of her parents in one hand and her old teddy bear in the other, and felt the emptiness in her soul that had been with her all her life finally begin to fill. A week passed after receiving the DNA results. Catherine took a vacation. She needed time to process everything that had happened. William didn't insist on communicating, realizing that his sister needed space to think. But this morning she wrote to him herself. "We need to talk, really talk." They met at his country house in the Hamptons, away from the noise of the city and prying eyes. The autumn wind was blowing fallen leaves across the manicured garden, and the waves of the Atlantic Ocean crashed on the shore nearby. Catherine sat on the terrace, wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the ocean. When she heard William's footsteps, she did not turn around. "Do you know what's hardest? Not the fact that I found my brother, and not even the story of the kidnapping. The hardest thing is realizing that my whole life could have been different." William put a cup of hot tea in front of her and sat down next to her. "I think about it too. Every night I wake up and ask myself, what if I had been in that car then? What if I could have protected you?" "You were a child," she said softly. "No one could have foreseen. But I was your big brother." His voice trembled. "Do you know what I remember most clearly from that evening? Not the moment of the accident, not the screams, but the way you waved at me from the back window of your father's car. You always did that, waving and sticking your tongue out." Catherine suddenly froze. "The black coat. You were wearing a black coat, and you were making funny faces at me." William turned sharply to her. "I don't know," she answered honestly, rubbing her temples. "Lately, my memories have been coming in fragments, like shots from an old movie. Sometimes I can't tell if they are real memories or my imagination." She took a sip of tea. "Tell me everything. From the very beginning. What happened that night?" William took a deep breath. "We were coming back from our cousin Michael's birthday party. It was late and raining. Your parents were driving in front in their BMW. You were sleeping in the back seat. I was riding with Uncle Robert in his car. We were delayed because I forgot my jacket and had to go back." He was silent for a moment, collecting his thoughts. A truck appeared on the bend in front of the bridge. It drove into the oncoming lane. My uncle said later that the driver fell asleep at the wheel, but now I know it was planned." "Planned?" Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. "Yes, it was. Mike, my private investigator, found evidence. It was an organized group. They would cause accidents and kidnap children. Then they distributed them to different orphanages, forged documents." "But why?" Catherine whispered. "Money," William answered bitterly. "Some of the children were sold abroad for adoption. Others, like you, were sent into the system to cover their tracks. They received money from illegal adoptions and donations from orphanages for their silence." He took out several documents from the folder. "Here are the police reports. 5 accidents that week. In 3 cases, children disappeared. 2 of them were found in Europe a few years later. They were adopted by childless couples who did not even suspect the crime." "And the 3rd child?" "That's you," he said quietly. "You were sent to St. Mary's Orphanage. Apparently, they didn't have time to arrange you for adoption abroad. A serious investigation began, and they had to hide." Catherine stood up and walked to the terrace fence. The wind tousled her hair. Did anyone else know? At the orphanage? Nurse Marta suspected. That's why she kept the documents. But she was afraid to talk, not after the death of the detective we hired. Thomas Rogers, Catherine remembered. She talked about him. Yes, she did. He was killed by faking a heart attack. He was too close to the truth. Catherine turned around, her eyes burning. And now what? You said you had proof? Yes, William walked over to her. DNA results, documents from Martha, detective reports. And something else, Mike found a former gang member who's willing to testify in exchange for a deal with the prosecutor's office. Who are they? Who was running all this? Richard Goldman, the former director of the orphanage. He was the liaison between the gang and the legal side of the operation. His boss is Frank Morris, an influential businessman. He financed the whole thing and had connections in the police that helped cover up the crimes. Morris? Catherine tensed. I know that name. He's been in the news a lot, donating large sums of money to charity. Exactly, William smiled bitterly. A perfect cover. Who would suspect a philanthropist of child trafficking? Catherine turned to the ocean. You know, all these years I've been thinking that maybe my parents were bad people. Maybe they abandoned me because I was useless. But it turns out they loved me. I had a family. And it was all taken away by some monsters. Her voice trembled. They should pay for this, for all the children whose lives they've ruined. William put his hand on her shoulder. They will. I've already contacted federal agents. They are opening a case, with our evidence and the testimony of the other victims. Other victims? You found someone else? Yes, 2 girls who were kidnapped the same year. One lives in Germany, the other in Sweden. They're ready to testify. Catherine nodded slowly. I'm ready too. I will tell everything I remember, even if it's only fragments. Are you sure? It won't be easy. I'll have to recall traumatic events, testify. I'm sure, she said firmly. Do you know why? Because there may be other children out there who still don't know the truth about their past. Other families who are still looking for their missing children. She turned to her brother. We have to do this. For their sake. For the sake of our parents. And for the sake of the 28 years that were stolen from us. William hugged his sister. Together. I'm not letting you go this time. They stood there for a long time listening to the sound of the ocean. The sun was slowly setting, painting the sky blood red, as if nature itself reflected their desire for justice. The trial lasted almost a year. Every day was difficult. Endless testimony, cross-examination, documents, examinations. Catherine and William spent long hours in court, listening to the horrific details of the criminal organization's activities. On the day the verdict was to be handed down, the courtroom was packed. In addition to journalists and ordinary spectators, there were other victims, families whose children had disappeared under similar circumstances, people who had been searching for the truth for years. Catherine sat next to William, squeezing his hand. They had become really close over the past year. Every memory that came back to her, every detail of the past that she recalled, strengthened their bond. Stand up, court is in session, the bailiff announced. Judge Martha Collins, a stern woman with graying hair, took her seat. The room fell silent. In the case of the United States v. Richard Goldman, Frank Morris et al., the court, having considered all the evidence and heard the testimony, finds as follows. Catherine held her breath. All the events of the past year flashed before her eyes. She remembered the day she first testified, how her voice trembled as she recounted fragments of her memories, the nightmares that had haunted her for years, how she cried when other victims shared their stories. She recalled the moment when a video of a former gang member's confession was shown in court. He described in detail how they organized accidents, how they kidnapped children, how they forged documents. William then gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his fingers turned white. Richard Goldman, the former director of St. Mary's Orphanage, is found guilty by the court of complicity in the abduction of children, forgery, and obstruction of justice. He is sentenced to 25 years in prison. A whisper was heard in the room. Goldman, now a gray-haired, gaunt man, lowered his head. Frank Morris, the organizer of the criminal scheme, is found guilty of organizing kidnappings, child trafficking, money laundering, and contract murder. He is sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of early release. Morris, still elegant in his expensive suit, did not flinch. Only his eyes betrayed rage. When the verdict was read, Catherine felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Not tears of grief, but tears of relief. Justice had finally been done. She and William walked out of the courthouse to the flashes of cameras. Journalists shouted questions, but the brother and sister walked silently to the car. "Where to now?" asked Catherine as they drove away from the court. "Home," William answered simply. It was time to go home. Home meant the old Anderson family home in the suburbs of New York City. William had kept it all these years, though he rarely visited it. Too many memories. When they arrived, the sun was already setting. The large Victorian mansion was buried in autumn leaves. Catherine froze, looking at the house. I remember these stairs. I remember sliding down the banister and my mother scolding me." William smiled. "Yes. And do you remember the swing in the backyard? Dad made it himself." "And the wooden tree house," Catherine suddenly exclaimed. "You promised to teach me the secret handshake so I could join your secret club. But you were too young and you got it wrong," William finished. "And then you got offended and said you were going to start your own club, just for girls." They laughed for the first time that day. Then William took out his keys. "Ready to go in?" Inside, the house looked almost exactly the same as it did 28 years ago. William had kept the old furniture, the photos on the walls, even my mother's books on the shelves in the living room. "I hired caretakers," he explained. "I wanted everything to stay the way it was, in case you ever came back." Catherine walked slowly through the rooms, touching things that brought back memories. Here's her mom's favorite chair by the fireplace. Here is her father's collection of architectural magazines. Here is her childhood room. "I haven't changed anything here," William said quietly, standing in the doorway. "Even the toys are still in their places." Catherine walked over to the bed where her old dolls were sitting. "You know what's strange? I've always loved dolls with red hair, even in the orphanage. And now I understand why my favorite doll was a redhead." She took one of the dolls, Annie. "Her name was Annie, right?" William sat down next to her. "Daddy bought her for your 4th birthday. A week before." He trailed off. Catherine put her hand on his shoulder. "It's all over now. We're together again. And no one will ever tear us apart again." They went down to the kitchen. William turned on the light and took a bottle of champagne from the fridge. "I prepared it in case we won the case. I think it's time to celebrate." "And the beginning of a new life," Catherine added. They sat at the old kitchen table, where the whole family used to gather for breakfast and talked about the future. "I'm thinking of restoring my parents' charitable foundation," William said, "but with a new mission, to help reunite separated families, to support the search for missing children." "That's a great idea," Catherine smiled. "You know, I've made a decision too. I want to go back to school. I'm going to finish law school." "Really?" William looked at her proudly. "Yes, I am. After everything that's happened, I want to help others find justice. Maybe I'll become a lawyer specializing in child abduction cases." William raised his glass. "To new beginnings?" "To family," Catherine replied. "To the home we finally returned to." When they later went out on the terrace, the moon was already high in the sky. Catherine touched her pendant. "Mom was right. The moon did bring me home." William put his arm around his sister's shoulders and they stood for a long time looking up at the starry sky. 3 months after the trial, Catherine sat in the office of the dean of Columbia Law School. Her hands trembled a little as she told her story. "You see," she said, looking into Dean Harrison's eyes, "I know that my situation is unusual. I'm 31 and I want to start my studies as a freshman. I have an incomplete college degree. I dropped out of college because of financial problems." But the dean held up a hand to stop her. "Miss Anderson, I've been following your case. The whole legal world in New York was talking about it, and you know what struck me the most?" Catherine shook her head. "Your testimony in court, your ability to present facts in a structured way, your understanding of legal nuances, your passion for justice. It's exactly what we look for in future lawyers." He pulled her papers from the folder. "Your grades in your previous studies are impressive. Your LSAT scores are among the best of this year's class. And your motivation letter," he smiled. "Do you know how many years I've been dean? 25. And this is the first time a motivation letter has ever made me cry." Catherine blushed. In the letter, she told me her story frankly, about her lost childhood, about the years of uncertainty, about reuniting with her brother, and about how the trial changed her outlook on life. "This morning I gathered the admission committee," the dean continued. "The decision was unanimous. Not only are we accepting you as a first-year student, but we are offering you a full scholarship." Catherine felt tears welling up in her eyes. "But how?" "Because people like you, Miss Anderson, are making a difference in the justice system. Your experience, your motivation. It's exactly what the legal profession needs today." He handed her an envelope. "Here are all the necessary documents. The academic year starts in 2 months. And one more thing." The dean took out a business card. "Professor Elizabeth Green is teaching a course on children's rights and family law. She would like to invite you to participate in a research project on improving the child welfare system." When Catherine left the dean's office, William was waiting for her in the hallway. "Well?" Instead of answering, she simply hugged him, crying and laughing at the same time. That evening, they celebrated at the old family home. Catherine spread out the admission documents on the table, looking at them over and over again, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. "You know," she said as they sat on the terrace with glasses of wine, "I always thought that my past was a burden, but now I realize that it is my greatest asset. I know what children who have lost their families go through. I know how important it is not to give up in search of the truth." William raised his glass. "And to all the children I will be able to help," she added. The moon shone brightly, reflecting in their twin pendants. There was a long way to go. 4 years of study, thousands of pages of legal texts, sleepless nights over textbooks. But Catherine knew it was worth it. Because now she had a purpose, she had a family, and she had the opportunity to turn her pain into a force that would help others find justice.